It's so simple. The name is your introduction, when you tell somebody your name, like I just did, or, when somebody refers to you by name, they want to know who you are. And we have learned, and this goes to the experience, that we have learned that a name that's a little bit familiar and also that's a little bit intriguing, gets you to that next sentence, which tells you the rest of the story or gets you, intrigued in the story.
Welcome to Brands for a Better World, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the people and products building a more just, healthy, and regenerative future for us all. Tune in weekly, and together, we'll learn about why these better products and brands were created, how they're helping fix broken systems, and what you can do to support them. My hope is that you'll discover some new brands to love and get some sparks of inspiration that will help you live your best life. Hi, I'm your host, Gage Mitchell, founder of Modern Species, a sustainable brand design agency helping better brands grow to scale their impact. If you like this show, please help it grow by leaving ratings and reviews on your podcast app and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. Maybe this will be one of them. On this episode, I'm speaking with Karin Hibma Cronan, co-founder of Cronan, about how the name of a product or consumer brand sets the tone of the experience, the common attributes of a good name, stories of how she named Goodbelly, the Amazon Kindle, TiVo, and more, and the importance of great questions when setting strategy or designing for positive impact. Then we wrap up with a rapid round question segment. Enjoy.
My name is Karin Hibma, also known as Karin Hibma Cronan, because I married this lovely man named Michael Cronan. And together we built an agency that we, in our final years, called Cronan. Originally it was Michael Patrick Cronan Design, Inc., which is not a very efficient name. And also during the 50 or so years that I've been doing this work, I have evolved to become what I call a strategic identity consultant. And I work with companies and clients individually to help mentor and help them achieve their greatest success through strategic identity.
I love it. And actually, identity is where I want to start the conversation too, because I know the word branding, some people don't like because it also just calls up like a hot iron stamped into the back of a cow or something like that images, right? But to some degree, like branding is like building the whole experience. And on your website, you talk about the fact that experience is the identity, right? Like the identity isn't a logo or just a name or a font or a color system or imagery or anything like that. It's the full experience of the brand. So with that said, I know you do a lot of naming in the process of identity. So where do you feel like a name fits into the overall experience of a consumer brand?
Well, it's so simple. The name is your introduction, when you tell somebody your name, like I just did, or, when somebody refers to you by name, they want to know who you are. And we have learned, and this goes to the experience, that we have learned that a name that's a little bit familiar and also that's a little bit intriguing, gets you to that next sentence, which tells you the rest of the story or gets you, intrigued in the story. And also that helps your client, to be able to tell their story. And that's part of the work that's why we evolved from being originally at a research company that evolved to working with my husband and partner on it in a design business where we were doing identities and logos and all of that normal stuff. And then we evolved to specifically focus on the naming. And then he passed away. And then I've been working more on the strategic identity, which less is about putting a name on something and more about working with the company to figure out, what the whole aspect of it is. But the experience, we learned that from some of the early Disney Imagineers that, when you get in the line for the ride, right, that's the beginning of the experience. And clients love learning that because they need, you need to have the experience all the way through. And you recently had a conversation about the experience of a bad product or, of a not a bad product, but just something that didn't live up to its identity. or an identity that defeated the product. And so
Yeah.
you have to have those things go together, or you don't get the result that you are intending to achieve.
Right. Yeah, that's one thing I was going to say as a follow-up maybe is that a name similar to a logo or other parts of the identity, it sets the tone for the experience to some degree, right? It starts to say, here's what to expect. Like if I meet somebody and their name is Bob and they introduce themselves as Bob, that's one expectation I might have for who this person is. But then if they say, my name is Robert or Roberto or something like that, it changes my expectation of what this conversation is going to be like or who this person is, right? So same name, just is it the more formal name? Is the shorter nickname? Is it with an accent or anything else like that? Just starts to set the tone of the conversation, and I start to build expectations of what I think that experience with that person will be like, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it also, you had Christopher Gavigan on the podcast, and when we renamed Children's Health Environmental Coalition as the Healthy Child, Healthy World, he loved it because he said it was essentially his elevator pitch, that he could be in a, going up to a meeting and shake somebody's hand and, say, hi, I'm Christopher Gavigan from Healthy Child, Healthy World, and half of his mission was accomplished. And then the best part was we repurposed that acronym, which they had failed, it was a 25-year-old organization at that time. They had failed to register that acronym. So there were other people which had the CHEC acronym. And we, unfortunately, like everyone we played with, check it off the list, check, none of which was going to get us to the objective of, what we have ended up calling creating healthy environments for children. How about that? And we just repurposed the acronym into a tagline. And I mean, he couldn't believe it. I mean, that's been the biggest thing that we found in our work. And we usually have to kind of warn clients, and it sounds a little, self-serving to warn people, but it really is in their best interest that you can 10x the responses to their product if you hit that target of experience. So, in your example, I was kind of charmed by Bob, but then I really went like thinking Roberto, that's like exciting. So, I mean, there is magic in a name, and obviously we should use that magic, to achieve our noble purposes. So, it's a good thing.
And speaking of the magic in a name, since you've come up with a lot of really amazing names that are basically household names now for organizations. What do you feel like is the recipe for a good name?
Well, I have this great Karin Hepburn recipe for making brownies that, whatever I've made for dinner, I put that in the oven, while we're having dinner. And then about 45 minutes in, the smell of those brownies, comes wafting out. So it's one of my favorite recipes. And the Karin Hepburn line in it is you put in the egg into the hot batter and you beat like mad. And just that beat it like mad, is really fun. So we call what we do an approach. I don't think that any client wants to feel that we are using a recipe on them.
Right.
Either when you're making a brand new name for a brand new product, there's, so much hope and ambition and desire and also uncertainty and fear and all those things. And you really need to be there. And you've seen it on my websites or whatever that, we listen deeply. And then we review what we're listening. And then we do rapid prototypes, just like in good therapy, we come back, what I heard you say was, the repeating to them. And the biggest thing is that it's an interactive approach, that truly we want the clients to come along on the journey with us. Partly because in the end, I want them to own the process, the approach themselves so that they can repeat it. And also because I truly don't want them to feel that they've gone off in the wilderness. Back to recipe, I'm not really that good at just throwing random things into a pan and hoping that I get something out of it.
Yeah.
So, we have found, and I mentioned, startup and early on first product clients. The other is clients that have been around, like I mentioned with, Czech, that have been around for 25 years, and they're either stuck or they're tearing themselves apart. And, there's a wonderful word that doesn't get used much, which is dysergy, where everybody's pulling in a different direction. And, the job is to essentially spin all that back into synergy and re-energize the company, around that. And these are things that, as I said, I've been doing this for a really long time. And the benefit to that is that I have seen things that we did that we didn't know that we could have, should have done that as well. And now with current clients, I can say, and we all know the same stories. There was a period of time around the turn of the century where, we were naming all of the .com, startups, these amazing companies and amazing identities, none of which exist now, And one of the hardest things is working with a company to have them actually be able to see, into the long now, to be able to see into a future and work their way towards it, because, people are very tactical. They want like immediate short-term results, and tactics are really important, but that stratos, the stratosphere, the looking at the big picture and seeing the field, that's the G part of strategy, is something that when you make people comfortable with that, that's how you approach things and what you do. They're kind of willing to join up with you to go along for that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you've been at this for so long and done it so many times that while you may not know exactly where the journey is going, you're going to get somewhere and get something good out of it. Right. So they kind of trust the process with you, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And also, I do always give people, there's some case studies on our website, but I also usually pull out case studies that are relevant to that particular client, because it always helps people to see that before they knew what they didn't know, they didn't know it. Yeah. The classic, I didn't know what I didn't know until I knew it, and then you don't know what else you don't know. But I truly appreciate the opportunity to work with people to get to these desired outcomes, because my colleague Roger Martin is a brilliant strategist, and he talks about strategic intent. And I always like that because it feels good. Intention is a wonderful thing. And a lot of people don't realize that you've got to start with an intention, like, I'm hungry. Okay. Well, what am I going to go? Am I going to make something, or am I going to order in, or am I going to go out, or am I going to call a friend and say, what you having for dinner?
Yeah.
It's like, and then you start putting the pieces together to build out, what that's going to be.
Right. To some degree, those intentions are guardrails that help you focus where you should point your strategy, right? Because ordering from a restaurant's a whole different checklist of steps that need to happen in order to pick the restaurant, figure out what you want to order, wait for it or go pick it up or whatever, compared to I'm going to cook something at home or go out with a friend or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. And intention is really powerful. It's part of what helps focus groups, because if you can align, back to my dysergy and synergy, if you can help people align their intentions, very often people are truly all seeing the world from their different part of the animal, and when you can align everybody's intentions, they do start feeling that satisfaction that their needs are being met and that their perceptions are being recognized and that their voices are being heard. It's a lot to do that, because it's not just a, boom, here you go, or, a fast food menu where like it's consistent, it's going to be the same menu every time, even though that worked, that worked, that still works. But, at a certain aspect of the world, you want predictability, but the other part of it is to be able to actually enjoy and embrace, curiosity and uncertainty, which is, one of your questions. So.
Right. Yeah. And I could definitely see how a recipe, because like a recipe, like you were saying about the brownies, it's like, this is how you make this one thing the same every time, right? So I could definitely understand that there's not a recipe for a great name. But what if I twist the question this way? What do you think are some of the common attributes of a good name? Like, is it the length of the word? Is it spelling?
Oh, yeah,
like easy
question.
to spell, easy to read, easy to say? Is it, I think you were saying a little bit before, a little familiar, a little intriguing? Like, what do you feel like the best names have in common?
Well, I truly love that I have a pocket full of examples. So when Steve Demos, who had created Silk Soy Milk, had sold that brand and had found himself becoming essentially the Orville Redenbacher of that brand, and he wanted to be more active, he and a colleague started this company that they wanted to make a probiotic fruit-based drink, non-dairy. And we spent a lot of time talking with him about, whether or not, we could help him identify that, because Silk Soy Milk had evolved that name over a period of many, many, many years. And Silk is such a great name, still is. And, he had come up with it through his own process. So we spent the usual amount of time with him, exploring some really great possibilities, but we ended up, he either had been a partner in, or he knew of a deli in Boulder, Colorado that was the Good Belly Deli. And boy, did that name just, for a probiotic drink that was going to help with your gut health, boom, it just landed it. And it was so intriguing. And that was one of the ones, like I said, where they launched it as a sample at Whole Foods. I mean, you and your, audience knows how hard it is to get shelf space, and right. Whole Foods enabled them to do it. Well, they were giving out free samples in the street, and the stuff is delicious. I mean, I keep 2 or 3 cartons of it in my refrigerator, at all times, partly because it just makes me happy, but also because I truly just like it in my life. But now when I go to the store, I laugh because every name is trying to meet or beat that name.
Yeah.
And they were a little slow to get the market space. So there were a lot of other probiotic brands that came in. And luckily now stores have the segment where all the probiotics that aren't dairy can fit in. But originally there wasn't even shelf space for it. So, right. We kind of elbowed our way into the market and the opportunity there. So the keys for really good name, I mean, I truly love the really short names, and Tebow was one of those where the question that we were asking was, what's the next TV going to be? And we had renamed a collaborative of internet service providers, actually cable companies back in the day. And the original naming firm had named them SYNDIC. And they wanted us to do a logo for that. And my husband said, "You're not going to like it." And they said, "Why?" And it was because, well, it has sin and dick in it. And so they went back to the naming firm, and the naming firm added an A at the end of it. So it became Syndica, which but it's like once you saw, that other name, you couldn't unsee it. So we named them Verio from Veritas. And, it was one of the first namings that we had done. And it just was a fun, wonderful logo. It worked great for the companies. It did all that. And so when we came to TiVo, it made it easy for IO, the in-out from engineering, to slide into the TV IO. And what was such a revolutionary product, who knew you could stop live broadcast TV? I mean, that was back in the day where you had to rush home and make sure your cassette was in the player, so that you could record the Letterman show, if you didn't want to stay up, until all hours of the night or whatever. So pretty innovative product. And then again, of course, there was a rash of IOing names that went through the market. So, when you're a leader, there tend to be a bunch of people who aren't necessarily followers, but they're people who are going to, follow along in your stream. So, Kindle was completely different than that, in that, when we got the opportunity to name an ebook, ebooks were dead. I mean, even people like, the wonderful, Sony had done the Walkman, recording device. Everybody loved Walkmans, but they didn't do anything for you, and they hadn't figured out how to turn that into a player, that could be this thing that Jeff was imagining. And we went through a whole range of categories of names and possibilities in that. And what he expressed, and I truly love this questioning process, because you're getting to what people really want. And when you ask them the questions to get to what they really want, he said, I just want to be able to, have somebody tell me the name of a book when I'm getting on a plane and be able to download it in less than a minute, and then get on the plane and read the book, And so we were thinking about what kinds of things are about that, like starting something. And kindling came up, which, is fun. Kindle, Voltaire talks about you kindle a fire, you kindle this. And of course, there was all the book burning stuff. And we thought, we'll live through that, but it's very interesting. Other times, I did this work after my husband had passed. I got reached out to by a wonderful organization that had been around again for a long, long time, called Surgical Eye Expeditions, that they do restorative surgery all over the globe for, people with cataracts, and doctors volunteer their times and fly in, and just an amazing organization. And their acronym was S.E.E. But they were just struggling with that, how could they come up with a name for their organization? Hello,
it's right there.
Lowercase c. I mean, it was, I truly love sometimes the hidden in plain sight opportunities. And so, you ask about whether or not, there was a recipe, these are really, it's the opportunity to create something that, is really distinctive and meaningful to that person. I mean, if we were you and I were going to create an identity for Bob, he would already be adorable, right? Because, Bob is a nice name.
He's a friendly guy. Yeah.
Yeah. He's got character, Roberto, he's got another character. So, I mean, the examples, and I mentioned Healthy Child, Healthy World, that, such a long name, but the URL for healthychild.org was available, which is surprising, but not surprising. That's the other difficulty, is that now there's so many things trademarked, and there are a limitation of URLs. And as someone who's doing this, you're not just having a good idea. You have to have it, again, back to my spinning or weaving metaphor, it has to weave into the whole system of everything that's there. But, every day there's new people coming into the world, and they're getting a name, and then they're going to grow into that name, and maybe they're going to be, our next leaders, or, our next rock star, or, maybe they're going to be a rock star. They're going to rename themselves,
Yeah.
So, I mean, there isn't really a formula, but there certainly are things that you want to avoid, like, bad mental associations with a name, you want to avoid. Yeah. Or you also want to avoid a name that just isn't going to stand out on its own in the, you have to think about how it's going to read in the newspaper article about that, product or company or whatever. And, one of the joys of Kindle is how many products at that time had a name that started with a K, and had that length. And every time now I hear like a Saturday Night Live skit or whatever, and that word pops through, and of course people are just saying it, and I'm going like, yes.
Yeah. That's got to be a good feeling.
Yeah, I do know that there are some missed opportunities in the world, and that those make me sad, but they're ones that either the company wasn't able to bring the opportunity to light, and it was a great name, but it was the wrong time or whatever.
Right.
And also there are some things that people have put out in the world that just don't have the energy behind them. And they're, unless they can figure out how to spin themselves, around and move forward, they're going to be stuck in that place forever. So,
yes. I don't do as much naming as you do, I'm sure, but I've done a decent bit of naming as well. And it's sad when some of your favorite names that you've come up with are tied to a company that just didn't make it or something like that. Like they either didn't get launched in the end because they couldn't get their funding, or they came and went because of whatever other reasons. And it was such a good name, and you don't want it to just go away forever. But there it is. Now it's attached to that company. And
and sometimes
names can't be reused always.
Sometimes the only asset remaining in a company is a great name and a logo, which they can sell to somebody else and repurpose. Yeah. I truly, in this last decade have been more working with companies to make sure that they can secure their funding. And, there have been some amazing opportunities where once you get things in the right order, the funding comes in, or the team comes in, or whatever. We worked for almost 20 years with a gentleman named Paul Pollock, who had started an international development enterprises helping bring people out of poverty. And we named the initiative with him Design for the Other 90%. And through the initiative, the Cooper Hewitt did a huge exhibition that traveled all around the country. And there were several companies started out of that, the design revolution. There were other people that took up the cause. It really was a transformative piece of work. And again, that was a longer name, but it told the story in the name. And sadly, he passed away a couple of years ago now. And it's interesting because when you've got something that is an individual that is kind of the visionary of it, everybody's got like their piece of the story, but they aren't necessarily the whole story. So, that's been interesting. But I learned a lot from him about how to do this questioning process, because he had professionally been a psychiatrist who got into this work through his passion for people and changing lives. And he really taught me a lot about asking questions and listening. And that was a real benefit. And the other part was that he actually was really intrigued with me and what I was saying, which was very nice, because sometimes when you're dealing with clients, they're just all about them, you know, and, he was never a client. We volunteered for all of that and paid our own expenses, to go and travel to third world countries and conferences and all of that. And, it was a real labor of love, but the feeling was mutual because we were loved while we're doing it, which was really a great opportunity. So.
Yeah, that's a great feeling too. That's why I love working with so many purpose-driven businesses, is because normally they're also really good people that just are doing things for the right reasons, right? And then they're appreciating you're also focusing on doing things the right way for the right reasons. And you're kind of working together on a common purpose of some sort. So it builds this camaraderie and mutual respect. That's really nice kind of benefit of working in this space.
Yeah. And I think my only caveat on all of that is that we all had to have our glass ceilings, the part where we don't imagine ourselves out of the stratosphere. And there are some times when we have worked with some really obnoxious people. And I tend to like tough characters, I don't necessarily, I don't choose to work with people just because they're agreeable and, we have happy, and I usually find it may be because I'm a gardener and a mother and a grandmother, that like, I kind of fall in love. I mean, unless people are really awful, and mean to other people, if they're just difficult, sometimes it's because they are really trying to create something that nobody else has ever created before. And, I find a certain joy in doing that, particularly, because it bumps up against that ceiling, and you have an opportunity to move forward, if you aren't always, making sure everybody's nice.
Yeah. No, I like that because it's some of the best ideas or conversations come out of that tension, right? When you don't necessarily agree, where everybody's not just yep, like kind of yes manning everything, but like where there's a little pushback, there's a little push pull, there's a little forces going against each other, and maybe in that tension that there's some possibility and some ideas and some energy in there. So I can understand that. I like that you kind of made that note too.
I love connecting people and sharing resources. So let's take a pause from this conversation for a brief intro to a podcast you might be interested in.
Hey, this is Eric, the founder of the Climify podcast. What's Climify? Climify is an educational podcast that connects climate experts to design educators, students, and the design curious to bridge design practice and climate action to inspire listeners to envision and create a sustainable future. This season, we are trying to change the system. We're speaking with impact leaders at the intersection of climate action and design to change oppressive systems that limit us and hurt the environment. We'll provide insight, inspiration, practical resources, and tangible ways to measure impact. Each episode ends with a call to action, a design prompt from our experts, encouraging everyone to challenge how the world is designed and to become change agents in their own lives. You can subscribe to Climify at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, back to the conversation.
Well, back to you ask about our approach. One of the other things in the listening deeply is that, when we have the dozen or so people come together at the beginning of a process for this intensive, I want like all the different voices in the conversation, because I don't want somebody over here, like critiquing something or another. Right. Back in the day before we developed all of this, there would be the time where you would have created something really great and the executive would take it and show it to their staff member, and that staff member would poke holes in it, which back to our, things that can't go unsaid, when they poked holes in it, which usually came from their own sense of ceiling or limited or possibilities. So we have one of our many rules is that, we want our ear to be in all those conversations. So, people are like sworn to secrecy during these sessions, so that they're not like going out and sharing it with somebody else. So if you bring everybody in, one really great client, a startup, the guys that were the founders, they brought their wives to the event because like that was who they were talking to about this. And those wives had really great insights. And the guys were actually surprised because they had never really had anybody listen to their wives other than them,
Yeah, that's funny.
And it was such a great process to do, and truly, was a helpful thing for them in the long run because it built up their strength about, hearing these different points of view.
Yeah, and it's I guess more modern, for lack of a better word, principle of creativity too, is that great ideas can come from anywhere, right? Get lots of people in the room and hear everyone's opinion rather than, it's just got to be the CEO or the executives that have the best ideas. Well, the person in the mailroom or the person that just brought our coffee might have just as good of an idea as everyone else. Let's put them all in the mix and see which ones float up to the top, right?
Well, one a private banking company, they had 50 employees, and then they had these messengers who were delivering the documents. Once the loan officers had done it, they were delivering it to the clients. Well, we brought those messengers into the conversation, and the executives and the boards were kind of shocked, but those messengers actually were going to the client and they were seeing what was going on in the client's workspace, and the client would, hey Joe, how you doing? And sharing tidbits back and forth and, what's going on. And we found that the messengers were really great distributors of the newest ideas coming out of the bank. And B, we found that they were great at giving the CEO, insights on what was going on at their clients. So, when they'd be riding up the elevator together, they could, talk. So we created this wonderful thing for them called diagonal teams. And I had the HR department take, all 50 plus their messengers, so probably almost 60 people, and do a chart. So it went from like the CEO down across all the middle managers, everybody, the tellers, and down to the messengers. And they had to organize themselves to have conversations once a week, and they could organize themselves in any way to do that. So they could have like coffee first thing in the morning if they wanted, or they could go and have a beer in the evening. And the way we kicked it all off was it was around the holidays, and we had them all go to a food bank and, box packages, but they had to do it as their diagonal teams. And what was so interesting was the CEO was just blown away. Well, maybe not him. He was a pretty smart guy. But our quarterback on the football team, he knew how to organize teams. But one of his executives was really surprised because the people who had the best ideas how to do things were often either like the tellers of the messengers, the people whose opinions they hadn't really been listening to. And they loved that. They kept that up, until their organization grew to a size that it was, they just kind of had having those conversations with one another. But I truly love that you can invent whole things for, companies that are specific to them, but that break down those limitations. Truly, it's for me, why I love this so much is that it's not really about that one result. It's about, the long-term transformation or change or whatever that we can see happen in the world. The minute I say see, my colleague and I who worked on the surgical eye expeditions, we kept laughing because we couldn't have a conversation without saying, I see that, did you see that?
Yeah. I definitely get caught in that all the time with client names. It just, You can't not think of that word every time you
Oh yeah.
say that
Oh
word. You
yeah.
can't not think of them, or every time you're thinking of them, you can't not think of that word. So
Well,
I love that.
that goes back to what's a good name, is
Yeah.
like if you create, a name like a Good Belly or whatever that, just gives you a little smile every time you hear it, it's transformative, and super
Right.
important.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of good names give you some sort of mental image like that, like you're mentioning Silk or, Good Belly, like that just gives you an idea of what the experience of that brand is going to be like, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's one thing, or the outcomes that you're going to get from that brand. And then there's some names that maybe they don't communicate much, but they're at least short and memorable and easy to say and easy to spell. I don't know, like I'm just going to say like Pepsi or something like that. Like maybe it had a meaning at some point, but I don't think anyone knows what that meaning is anymore. But it's there, it's stuck around, it's easy to say, it's not the prettiest word spelled out, etc., but like it's there. So I think sometimes there's a name that's just easy enough to own that space or easy enough to spell, and then there's some names like you're saying, like Good Belly and Silk, that actually say something and communicate something. And I obviously prefer the ones that say something and communicate something over the ones that don't, but I also know, to your point, like trademarks are getting harder to get, URLs are getting harder to get. So I feel like there's kind of an evolution to some degree towards names that don't mean something obviously off the top of everyone's head, just because it's easier to own to some degree too, and gives them more flexibility. Because I know you were mentioning some like longer descriptive names, and one of the things I thought it could be an interesting angle of conversation is names that evolve, because I see brands come out like this bar saves lives, or love good fats, or different names like that. Silk soy milk that ends up just being Silk eventually, right? Because they launch products other than soy milk.
Right.
Or one of our clients, So Delicious Dairy Free, where they started out as Soy Delicious Dairy Free and then changed it to So Delicious because they started selling coconut milk and other things. Or Love Good Fats dropped fats and is now just Love Good Foods or something like that, right? So names that were great for that place and time based on who they were at that moment and the movement and the seeds they were trying to plant in the industry and the pictures they were trying to paint in somebody's head. But over time, the company evolved and the name evolves with it. But there was some part of that name that got to stay, because that was also ultimately the essence. Like Love Good Fats, Love Good was the essence of that name, right? Fats was just happened to be about their keto line of products. Once they evolved beyond keto, Love Good still fits. So it's kind of interesting with names that can evolve like that.
Well, and ideally they should, because as, we were saying, the world is continuing to evolve as a rapid changing pace, and this is the part of it. So there are wonderful names that have been around for a long time. And I mean, truly, Coca-Cola was named after cocaine, which is easy. And Pepsi was named after giving you some pep, giving you some energy. So if I had to create or defend that name today, I would find all kinds of, associations around it. The Pepsi part, the Coke part, I put the cocaine back in and take it back into little tiny bottles,
Yeah.
But the problem for me with those entities is what the company has grown into. And I truly, I care about the people who, live in that world, but we ideally in this future that we're creating together are going to, back to my words about revolution and evolution, we are going to re-evolve into realizing that, as, the Japanese culture did for, millennia, they made recyclable containers or reusable containers for everything, packaged goods, all of that, because at that time there wasn't that. And I would like to be in a future where we truly, it's not just about that moniker, but it's about, what that company is. And it would be a huge job to do to try and, take something like that back down to its essence and create that kind of meaningful joy out of it. And I know there are lots and lots and lots of people that are, in that business and industry, and those shelves are there and the supermarket and the whole thing. But my Lord, we've got to evolve.
Yeah,
I mean, this is not going to last,
Right. And speaking of evolution and kind of thinking about positive impact and moving towards the future, since I heavily focus on impact-driven brands and sustainable design, et cetera, I'm often having people ask me for my best advice for young designers wanting to do more impactful work. And I always just say, be more curious. And the reason I say that is because if you're curious, you'll ask the right questions or better questions that will start to illuminate some of the unseen things in the system that you're designing for. If you ask questions around a package and say, well, what happens to this after somebody's done with it? You start to realize, oh, the materials or the number of materials or the way this package is formed has an impact on the world. And do we have to keep those materials? Do we have to keep that form? Do we have to keep those finishes in order for this to succeed in the market? Or can we make some changes so that it has a better end of life, right? But if you never ask that question, what happens to this package afterwards? Or what's this material made of? Or is that recyclable? Or is sin and dick some negative connotations or whatever? If you don't ask the right questions,
in your brain. Oh no.
Yep, it's in there now. If you don't ask those questions, you won't start to see the big picture. And once you see the big picture, you can design more holistic solutions. So it's all about that kind of curiosity and asking questions, which I know is a big part of your philosophy and process. It's all about making sure you ask the right questions or ask great questions so you can get great answers. So I'm curious, how do you make sure that you're always asking the right questions in your process?
Well, it's always when I talk to people about elegant questions, design answers, which originally was elegant questions, simple answers. And then we realized simple answers was not the right thing. And then I went through a period of time thinking questions, design, elegant answers. And then I realized, oh no, it's got to go back to the question. There's so many loops around this, but of course that's my brain, shifting. And I love that EQDA, the acronym is, it's the emotional quotient, it's wonderful because there is a part to this where, just like you were mentioning, the questions that aren't being asked, that's the most critical question. So when we talk to people in the beginning of a process, we usually tell them that we're not looking for the answers. We're looking for the right questions to ask. And that kind of shifts people's perspective. I also, I think I might have told you a little bit about our inoculating clients. We always tell them that they're going to feel a little fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the FUD at the beginning of a process. Yeah. And the way we inoculate them, which used to be not as much of a loaded term pre-COVID, but we would tell them that we had learned that when that uncertainty came in, that's when the really great ideas came in. So instead of in a process where people are all like, these guys don't know what they're doing, they'd all pull away from us. They would go, ooh, I'm feeling a little anxious now. And they'd pull together, and somehow or another, either through intention or a miracle, that's when a really great idea or an idea that had been there all along. Like TiVo was up on the board for a really long time until somebody, walked in the room and said, well, that's the name, isn't it? Because they could just see it clearly in their eye. So I think a little bit of the process here is one of making sure that you're always questioning. And with my oldest granddaughter, we have a list of about 100 questions that she uses as prompts at family dinner, because it gives her a way as a almost 14-year-old to enter into the adult conversation. So she'll ask a question that everybody needs to answer around the table. And they're wonderful questions like, what was the first concert you ever saw? Simple question.
Yeah.
But my gosh, everybody has a different answer. And it's a story that they've never would have had a chance to tell otherwise. And one of the questions would be, was if you could imagine it had a hidden door, into, that you could open up and you could go into another world, where would you go? And my middle granddaughter, who, it was wintertime and she was seriously into skiing, looked at the white wall, in their dining room and said, I wish I could just open that wall up and be on the ski slope,
Yeah.
And she took us all with her, we all went we all just were like, yeah, that whiteness just becomes like, going to the snow. So questions are very provocative, which is why you ask questions. And the best questions are the ones that do open up those hidden doors, to people's possibilities. And, I have strategic questions. I have, all kinds of process and approach questions. In fact, if I'm working with a client, I have my list of things that I need to find out from them pretty clearly there. How do they see the problem?
Right.
How do they see the solutions? Those are very strategic questions that get us to sometimes very surprising answers. Again, this dysergy trying to bring everybody together, because if an engineer sees the problem this way, but the, CFO sees the problem this way, or the salespeople see it that way, you have to kind of align all those perspectives. And the most fun is if you've heard everybody answer those questions, when you come back with the answers for them, you say, well, as Bob said, and as Gage said, and as Karin said, and you bring them all into the conversation, and they're all a little puffed up and, I was the critical part to that story,
Yeah.
and then they're all on board and it's great.
Right.
Humans are amazing. And it's one of the things that I'm loving most about this time. I think, I had the opportunity when I was in my late 20s to, do a project when I was still a researcher called Creativity, the Human Resource. And it was an exhibition for Chevron Centennial on contemporary living Americans who'd made major contributions in the arts and sciences. And they sold this exhibit, but then they had to figure out who those people were. So they called this little researcher, and I came in and, had to read 300 books and try and figure out who people were and then write them letters and call them up. So I ended up, and the phone would ring and it'd be Dr. Jonas Salk on the phone for me again, because he wanted to change the text. But my favorite of all those conversations was Margaret Mead was supposedly, literally was on her deathbed. She passed a month or two after that. And I was so excited. I didn't have a chance to go visit her. Some of the people like John Cage and Merce Cunningham I got to hang out with, but I called her and I had my little queue of questions I was all ready to ask. And she said, you can read about me in the books. I want to know what you're finding out from all these other people.
Huh. Yeah.
I was like, wow, she just turned my whole thing around on me. It's like I was telling you about Paul Pollack. She wanted to know what I'd learned in this process. And it was one of the most meaningful conversations that I've had, in my career, because I think she's probably one of the originators of what's called design thinking. She and Sarah Little Turnbull, who were both extravagant questioners, and listeners. So this process is one where you really benefit from, looking back in time, looking wide in your audience. And, colleague I was talking about, pattern breakers, he says you have to imagine yourself in the future and then pull the present towards the future that you imagine. So I think we have to be responsible, ideally collectively, for imagining a future that we all want to live in, not a dystopian future, but a future where, we get to enjoy the bounties of, where we are.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's beautiful.
I could talk for hours about this, Gage. This is my passion.
I know. And I keep wanting to ask lots of follow-up questions too. But one that just popped in my head that I think might be interesting insights is, you talked a lot about like the possibility of questions or where they lead or what great questions can do. What about bad questions? Are there questions that you specifically try to avoid, or framing of a specific question that you try to avoid because it will not yield the right results?
So this isn't actually my bad question, but it's a question that I've read, which is, other than Simon Sinek's famous "What's Your Why?", I've read that asking why questions is a bad idea because it leads people to justify their answers. And, the famous story about the children is that children ask why, repeatedly. But I do put that filter on my conversations with people, because if I can frame the question in a different way when they tell me something, because I don't want people to feel like they have to give me a black and white answer. I want an answer that's got color in it, or maybe I want an answer that's going to lead me to the next question. And I don't want to just challenge what they're asking. So I think, again, there is a reason, the classic, what's your why? Because what's your motivation? What's your purpose? What's your intent? But I think as a questioner, I need to be more generous so that I actually am, I'm looking for them to, feel like possibly like they're correcting maybe my misassumption, or, that they are confiding in me. One of the great lessons we learned over the years, we used to have this great big formal conference room, and we'd have these long meetings, and of course meetings over food. And then we'd go into the kitchen, and somebody would say in the kitchen, the meeting's going really well, but what I meant to say out there was, and it was like a whole new world opened up, because when they were in their formal structure, they felt like they needed to add an answer, along the, pre-given line, where when they were like helping, put the dishes away or coming in and getting extra beverage or whatever, that it opened up their humanness. So, I'm trying to think of any other bad questions. Mostly the thing is that I don't aspire to challenge people, because I don't in any way want them to feel that I already know the answer and I'm trying to find out if they do. I truly want them to feel that maybe I'm a little naive, which is one of the benefits of going into companies where you don't know anything about what they do or how they do it, because they tend to explain it to you in the simplest possible terms. Bingo, you've got the beginnings of your answer for what you're doing, So if I come across not really understanding, what actuarial tables are, or how, loans are, advanced, or what this particular engineering tool does or whatever, explaining it to me like you would explain it to, a naive person is the beginning of getting to the simplicity that will help them share and tell their story in a better way.
Yeah, I love that. In so many ways, I hadn't thought about the why being a question that forces people to justify their answer rather than digging deeper. And I think it probably depends on context, right? Because sometimes you use why just because somebody said something without any context and you want a little more context around that, right? But I also see your point of, if you get them to just dig into that one perspective, they're starting to build a mental wall around that idea, instead of kind of opening up a window and being like, well, this is my current idea, but maybe there's 10 others out there. But if you ask too many whys, they're just going to build a wall and have no windows anymore. So that's interesting philosophy.
And I don't know if you follow David Eagleman's Inner Cosmos podcast. He's a brilliant neuroscientist. And we truly need to understand that we are like, neural nets, and we can condition our neural nets in all kinds of ways. And people can actually, if they reinforce an opinion too strongly, they can actually calcify themselves into that opinion. So part of the art of good questioning is, if you are challenging, someone to figure out another way. I mean, they're wonderful therapy questions like, could you explain that to me more? Instead of just saying, why are you holding that rigid position, you idiot?
Yeah.
Or, could you tell me that in another way? Or, could you give me an example of that? I mean, there's lots of ways. I mean, when you become a connoisseur of questions, there was a wonderful New Yorker campaign that I would love to steal the title of, and it was called "The Right Question Changes Everything." And, it was just brilliant, because that's true. You're looking for the key to unlock, just as we were talking about, with the question that's not been asked, or the outcome that's not been, again, back to challenge, but, foreseen. I mean, we live in a world where we drive gas-powered cars because in the combination of petroleum and tire, people wanted that rather than the electric cars that were first.
Yeah.
We live in a world of social media where we're all happy to get likes, and other people are building vast fortunes based on our willing, acquiescence to, and I don't think that they intentionally started out to be harmful, but, and I have another colleague, a brilliant woman named Denise Hearn, who is not an economist, but she writes about economics, and she understands. And I have these ongoing monthly conversations with her about exchange of value. And I think it's a really important thing, particularly in the, area that you're working in, because people are trying to create these positive outcomes. And the exchange of value comes to be one where, we used to be, villagers that were working and giving a portion of our harvest to, the person who'd allowed us to work their land, and,
right.
And we had a place to live and thing to do and whatever, but, it's a very interesting process. And I think we're possibly in another century, we can look back 100 years ago and realize what, the world assumed, between the 1890s and the 1920s. Look at that arc of transformation. You look at us, the 1990s to the 2020s, and here we are, we truly need to be able to do that backcasting thing, like collectively imagine where we'd like to end up. And, for me, I'm going down the joy path,
Love it.
I love spreading the word about yummy food brands. So let's pause this conversation for a brief intro to a Latin-owned Salvadorian frozen food brand you might want to try.
Listen to that sizzling. That is a Santa Fruits pupusa. We've made cooking, breakfast, lunch, or dinner easy. Find our products at a freezer aisle near you, or visit our website at winterfoods.com. XINCAFOODS.com.
All right, now let's get back to our sizzling conversation. See what I did there?
Yeah, you bring up some good notes too about the like you said, the right question changes everything. And I think some of the challenges that you were describing of maybe a company that started out with good intentions, but then ends up needing to protect their way of doing things because it's currently benefiting them, but even if it's not benefiting the rest of the world, like probably the reason they got into that situation is because people weren't asking the right questions anymore, right? People started filtering their questions based on different motives or fear or whatever else along the way. And somewhere along that journey from going from a good intention company to maybe the company that's holding humanity back was missed opportunity to ask the right questions. Because exactly to your point of like, let's say the gas vehicles, sure, they had to like dig in and create these gas vehicles, because of maybe motivations of oil companies or whatever. There's like a lot of money and a lot of momentum around that space. So this fear of electric vehicles or whatever is an enemy. But if they had been asking them the right questions of what is our purpose? Is it to sell gasoline or is it to fuel the future? And you know what? Fuel can be anything. Fuel can be wind. It can be power. It can be water. It can be gasoline. It can be all these things. And if they'd been asking themselves the right questions and getting back down to their essence, or continuing to remind themselves of the essence of what they're trying to build in the first place, they could keep building a company that has profits and everybody wins, et cetera, but also be one of the co-designers of the future. Instead of fearing the future, they could have built the future. And it's just a matter of like not asking the right questions.
Yeah, but it's also really, really hard. So it's an amazing story that Norman Rockwell's brother was an engineer who was working with a company that eventually ended up creating the hard shell plastic soda bottles because they needed to create a bottle that, was lighter weight than the heavy glass bottles that had to, go back and get cleaned and repurposed and sent back out and whatever. There were a whole bunch of problems that they were solving, but the problem that they didn't solve was what do you do with all that plastic at the end of it?
Right.
And, I'm sure that there were no bad intentions at that point, but, we live in a world with, giant blobs floating around in the ocean of discarded plastic. So, I truly admire a company like Patagonia, who's worked really hard to continue to evolve themselves. I just re-listened to Yvon Chouinard's, The Righteous Company, which is, it's complicated because it's now a decade plus old, and you can realize that the future was not as close as he imagined it to be. At that point, he was seeing all the optimism from, a decade ago, and we've fallen back a little bit on all of that because, money is power, and our society rewards power, and power has influence on us. And it's a very complicated human equation that has been going on for millennia. So I think purpose-driven, is always, and we call it noble purpose. We've chosen, and I've been really blessed my entire career to have, other than, when I mentioned Chevron, at that point, it didn't occur to me that, that was a giant chemical company, that was supporting this creativity project, but the purpose of their exhibition was noble. And I was there. Whether I would turn that opportunity down today, I don't know. But I do think that it's really hard for us to, as we said, to know what we don't know that we don't know. So there was a process. Edward de Bono was a famous, strategist who worked about making sure that, in factories in Germany, particularly, and I think in general in Europe, but if you had outflow from your factory, that it had to go into the river above where you had your intake come in. because it meant that you had to have clean outflow so that you could have clean inflow. And that was a simple modification, because if, your outflow was downstream from your factory, you were leaving it to the next guy to figure out how to solve that problem. But it is very hard to have people think that way. Right. And it's part of what is the problem in, government, politics, bureaucracy, corporate governance, capitalism, all of these venues that are there. So, I think at a certain point, it comes down to education and, how we interact with each other as people, that we try to make our communities better and to elevate things that we think are, noble purpose, and to try, when we're designing something or another, to be solving something that we think is solving, a more important problem. So, it is not easy. It's not like you can just transform something overnight. I mean, what did Patagonia do? They were first making fibers with, this shredded plastics, and then they found out that they were coming out in the dryers and ending up in the lint in the dryer, or back into the air as little particulates of micro, plastics or whatever. So we've got some major serious problems to collectively solve.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, to your point, it's not easy, but again, it just comes back to questions, right? Because it's about asking the right questions, which sometimes is from a systems perspective. I think a lot of the examples you were given was somebody wasn't in the room saying, well, what happens if we succeed and this thing really scales? Then what? What happens to all this material? Or what happens if we're so successful that we run out of material? Or what happens if we're so successful that now we've got new problems that we created because now the system has flipped and plastic is everywhere or whatever? But there's these questions that you can ask from a system standpoint of time and scale and things like that people don't always ask during the conversation when they're trying to fix a problem for right now, at this current time, at this current scale, with these current parameters. They come up with a great solution, like you said, like a plastic bottle, which at the time was a great invention, more durable, lightweight, etc. Lower footprint, maybe in some ways, in terms of shipping across the country or across the world for a company like Coca-Cola. But nobody was there asking, well, what happens if we're really successful? What happens in 50 years? What happens, so on and so forth. There's questions that, you're not always going to ask at the time of invention, but those are questions you can ask as stuff becomes more obvious. Like you said, like Patagonia, at the time they didn't ask themselves, well, what happens to plastic materials in washing machines or dryers, or, all the plastic furniture or anything, what happens when this, clothing or this couch that I'm sitting on starts to abrade and those little pieces of microplastic end up in the air. People weren't asking themselves those questions at the time. But once we started thinking that way, we ask the questions and we find solutions. And it all just kind of brings me back to this quote that someone planted in my brain a while back, but it was committed but not attached. And the idea there is I'm committed to the outcomes of creating better clothing or a more lightweight package or whatever, but I'm not going to be attached to any specific solution on my journey in that mission, right? So I'm not going to be attached to the plastic bottle, or I'm not going to be attached to the plastic fiber clothing, because there might be a better way. Right now, this is the right way, it feels like. But once the rest of the system starts to become more obvious to me, or time and scale catch up, and I realize that I maybe created some problems while I was solving some, now I'm not going to be attached to that. I'm not going to dig in deep. I'm going to keep my mind open to the next possible solution. And it's all just back to questions, right? Are you asking the questions? Are you allowing your team to ask you the questions along the way?
And we live in this amazing thing called nature that has been self-recreating for millennia. I used to go to client meetings where we would be looking at the latest new, gadget, widget, whatever they'd created. And you're in the shower in the morning and this little tiny thing, comes flying in. And it's like a self-creating, self-replicating, whatever invention of nature that ideally is solving some problem, bringing pollen from one flower to another, or something or another. And I think one of the real opportunities in the future, as we become more challenged by these things, is this goal of realizing that we live in a system which is continually evolving around us, and our job is to start becoming part of that evolutionary process. Right. I mean, the seasons come and go, and it's blossoms, fruits, berries, whatever, leaves fall, and then rest, and then boom, 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 there they come again, and
right.
We don't seem to have become really comfortable with that process. I mean, we are happily living longer, healthier lives now because we're taking, better care of ourselves in many ways, but we might also, be loaded with microplastics that, there's bunches of things where, right. I think back to our questions and the kids that are asking why, there was a wonderful social media post about like the questions that kids would ask their grandparents, because what was clear to their grandparents was completely like the child saw it in a completely different way.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I like the idea of that I mentioned the naivete. There's this joy in being able to be continually learning and experiencing and questioning. And I do feel that there has been too much pressure in the world for people to come up with answers rather than the right questions to ask.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that's a good part to wrap up the conversation, because I have a million other questions I want to keep asking you, but I also realize we're at or even beyond time. If you've got a little extra time, maybe we could do a quick rapid round. And we'll just try to keep it short if you have time.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll try to go fast and not add too many follow-ups. But I just have to say,
I adore you, Gage. And one of my things in first working with you on the AJ board was that you asked such great questions, and they were not centered in any kind of attitude or opinion. They were just things that we needed to ask those questions about. So, yeah. I
appreciate that. We're team questions. Love it.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, so we didn't get a chance to talk too much about Walking Man, but Walking Man is your clothing line that you designed and ran for a while. I think it's still up and running. So it's still some supply left, right?
1998 website. Yeah.
So my first rapid round question was going to be, what's your favorite clothing line that you didn't design and why?
Well, I purposely wore today. There's a wonderful woman named Breda Haran who had a knitwear line. She unfortunately doesn't still manufacture, but her clothes are so joyous, and they are long lasting and always fashionable. And one of the things that we did with Walking Man was that we had the opportunity with that company to put ourselves in the client's side of the table. So when my husband, who was the designer for the product and also co-design with me, but also all the marketing materials and whatever. And he would do these giant catalogs that were going to cost us umpty bazillion dollars to produce and mail and all of that. As a client, you're going like, But we also had extraordinary success, which was wonderful because we did a lot of things that nobody else was doing at that time, and we got some fantastic results. We also designed long fiber, long lasting clothing that wouldn't shrink and twist and whatever. So the reason that the line is still there is because clients come back to me 20, 25 years later and say, my urban uniform has worn out. Do you have? And they want a replacement of that. And I do have an archive of, those things, but it's adorable that we actually designed a company that, would essentially, be around for that long. So Breda's clothes are like that. I do adore her design site, but I don't shop for clothes because I don't need them. I've got a closet full of, beautiful things that I've had for 20, 30, 40 years. So
yeah, I love that. I love it from a sustainability standpoint too, right? Buy things that last instead of break down constantly and you need to rebuy them.
Well, back to Patagonia, that was one of their wonderful campaigns, is don't buy this jacket, which was just brilliant. And then now they are really serious about, well, they've been for a long time about recycling. So my granddaughters, if a zipper broke on one of their little ski jackets or whatever, it went back and it came back actually repaired, which was and they loved it because that was like their favorite little ski jacket. So fun.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so we talked a lot about naming, of course. So what's a brand name that you really love that you didn't come up with, or one that bothers you? And I'll just throw an example out. Like, I think a lot of people have been talking about Elon's renaming of Twitter to X, just because it's thrown everything into the mix. Like, what do you even call a tweet now? Or what's the logo? Or will it be recognizable? Or, there's so many issues with that name, I guess people have. So that would be one I'd just throw out there that's like bothers a lot of people. But I'm curious to hear what you think. What's a name that bothers you or something you really love?
Well, I will just add in that getting your name talked about is part of the desirability of naming anything. And if people continually have to repeat your name, so in the example of Twitter and X, to be able to say that, the company formerly known as Twitter, they're like, it's an evil ploy, but it certainly works. Truly, I do admire, and I've mentioned Patagonia multiple times, but Amazon, Patagonia, those were wonderful names. Apple originally was Apple Computer, and they were able to drop the computer and just become Apple. And then I remember when the iPad came out, everybody was like, ooh, and my husband was the one that I think the Wall Street Journal reached out to, and he said, it's Apple, people will get over it. And it's very interesting because the interim CEO naming that Steve had taken for himself when he came back to the company enabled them to put that iCEO to be the iPhone, the iPad, created this whole wonderful sequence of things. And the iMac was an absolutely brilliant combination of product, delivery, expectation. I bought them like they were jelly beans and gave them to family members who, needed to come into the computer age. And they were friendly and easy. And, it got everybody over kind of that, that junior hump of getting themselves into this area. So it's a continual evolving process, but I think the names that I don't like are the ones that are just they don't tell a story, and they're hard to remember, or it seems like the person who created them or is selling them doesn't care, and then I don't care about that company. There's a bunch of things on there. I think I got interviewed in past company about Meta, and that was just, they jumped into that and it was fine. And, and I totally adore that Google grabbed Alphabet as their, big corporate name. Oh, I was so jealous. It's like, they don't need to use it very much because it's just their big corporate name. But we always said that TiVo should have kept their original name of Teleworld and then had the product be TiVo and the stock symbol be TiVo. And then they could have had TiVo live in Teleworld. Right. And then Teleworld could have created more babies around that. So it's always an interesting, it's a really interesting thing. But just like our names, Gage or Karin or whatever, you kind of grow into your name and you associate the meaning with who you've grown into it. So.
Yeah, exactly. Positive or negative. Hopefully positive for our names, but for some company names, maybe negative. Okay, so got time for one more rapid question. So I'm going to skip to the end here, which is, this podcast is called Brands for a Better World. So what does a better world mean to you?
Well, so you and I both know that I do not love brands. And, the hot metal, seared flesh, and the smell of burning hair is not the association that I would, put on a better world. Thank you very much. I know you moved on from Evolve CPG, but, I think, evolving better brands, is on there. Better is also competitive. I think that leaders lead, and if they are good leaders, people follow. So this better world is that I think the more that there's a dialogue between people who can see and imagine the future outcome that we want to go to. I truly am a Pollyanna. The whole idea that you could get a whole bunch of cranky, stuck in their position people to start seeing other people's perspectives and to be able to share ideas and collaboratively do things. I mean, Reagan was brilliant when he told Gorbachev that if the aliens landed, we would all, work together to save humanity. To me, this thing about practicing joy is so important because the goal is that anything you practice, you get better at. And so if we actually practice joy every day, you'll get a little bit more towards experiencing that. And I use that as a personal example that, there are times when I'm, not feeling sure about myself or feeling confused or whatever. And if I just take that breath and enjoy for a minute, I find that's enjoy that it's a miracle. Things that I wondered what were going on were actually starting to happen. I just I wasn't the one stirring the pot, life was there. So hopefully that Pollyanna is the world that we're all participating in, where we're all looking to see each other's possibilities and to support and encourage one another.
I love that. Yeah, that's a great reminder for all of us to be trying to practice what we want to be and practice the things we want the world to become or whatever, right? But it's all about just showing up for what we want the world to be day in and day out and what we want ourselves to be. And to your point, that's a lot of the focus of this show is people who not only believe in better, but actively pursue it and talk about their actions of building better products, better consumer brands and a better world together, better businesses and stuff. So I love that. I love the kind of focus on joy and kind of like that focus on the self, show up as a better person, and then you'll put better things out into the world, right?
That's why we call these practices. But the fun thing is that if what we do with our practices is practice joy, that's pretty good.
Yeah, not bad. Love it. So thanks for carving out some time in your schedule to geek out on naming and curiosity and impact and all these kind of fun things with me. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you showing up in the world in the ways that you do and trying to build a better world, ask better questions, practice joy, support initiatives that are trying to take care of people. Like you do so many great things, and I appreciate following along with what you do. So thanks for doing all that you do, and thanks for taking some time out to share it with our community.
Well, and thank you, Gage, for sharing these so many journeys with us. And I am eager to see your next evolution in all of this. So I'm there for the ride. So, okay.
Love it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks for listening. To learn more about Karin or her agency, go to Cronan.com. That's CRONAN.com.
If you like this show, remember to help us grow by liking, reviewing, and sharing. If you're new here, don't forget we have over 100 episodes in the archive. Some might be called Evolve CPG, but it's the same show, so dig in for more goodness. If you consider yourself an impact-driven professional, join me over at impactdriven.community, where we're supporting each other's growth as impact leaders.